There are towns that keep secrets, not by choice, but by habit. I don't mean big cities where crime gets lost in the noise. I'm talking about those quiet, isolated places where people don't just know each other. They've known each other for generations. And that's where I ended up, Oak Hollow. I was sent out there for a missing person case. Just a simple assignment, or so I thought. But like always, things turned out to be anything but simple. The call came in at 5 a.m. A girl, 16, had been missing for 3 days, and it was beginning to look less like a runaway and more like a full-blown disappearance. The local police had been searching, but her family had pulled in some favors, so my department got involved. I was called in to bring a fresh set of eyes to the case. The drive was long, and as I got closer to Oak Hollow, the paved roads turned to gravel, and the houses looked older. This place had its own rhythm. You could tell it wasn't used to outsiders. As I pulled into town, the first thing I noticed was how people watched my car roll by. Just watching, in that quiet, unnerving way. I started at the Oak Hollow police station. Sheriff Deacon was running the place, a guy in his 50s with deep lines around his eyes. He greeted me with a wary look, like he wasn't thrilled about me being there. The missing girl's name was Lily Harper, and according to him, she'd last been seen walking home from a friend's house on a Saturday night. She was supposed to be home by 9 p.m., but she never showed up. The friend, Kara, hadn't seen her leave, but assumed she'd taken her usual shortcut through the woods to get home. I asked the sheriff if this was common, kids going missing. He shook his head but didn't say much. He seemed closed off, and I got the sense he knew something he didn't want to share yet. I headed to the Harper house next. They lived in a small bungalow on the edge of town. Her mother, Sarah, looked exhausted, bags under her eyes, voice hoarse. Her father, Mark, was more on edge, pacing in the kitchen. They both seemed desperate, clinging to hope, but clearly fearing the worst. The next day, I decided to check out the shortcut she usually took. It wasn't much, just a worn trail through the woods between her friend's house and hers. But you could tell it was used regularly, mostly by people in town cutting through to avoid the long loop around the road. Halfway down the path, I noticed something odd. A blue hair clip, barely visible in the dirt. I put on gloves and picked it up. When I later showed it to her parents, her mother confirmed it was Lily's. But what was stranger was that just a few feet further down the trail, there were deep tire tracks. Fresh ones. The dirt had been disturbed recently. I went back to question her friend, Kara. She seemed nervous, kept looking over my shoulder like she was expecting someone else to come in. I asked her again about that night, and her story stayed the same. They'd watched a movie, talked for a bit, and then Lily left. But then, I asked her about the path. She hesitated and glanced down, mumbling something about how her parents had always told her not to use it at night, that it wasn't safe. I pushed her a little more, and she finally said, "Some of the guys in town, sometimes they go out there at night. I don't know why, but they're always acting weird about it." She wouldn't say more, but it was enough to raise my suspicions. Back at the station, I decided to bring this up with Sheriff Deacon. When I mentioned the tire tracks, he went quiet. I could see him mulling over whether he should tell me something. I asked him point blank if there'd been any similar cases, or if there was anything unusual about that path. After a long pause, he finally opened up a bit. He told me that about 20 years ago, there had been a string of incidents, mostly girls who'd been harassed or frightened near that same trail. Some of the guys from town would mess around, drinking and causing trouble. He said it was just young men acting stupid, but there was something in his tone that suggested it was more than that. I went through old reports and found that one of those men, Kyle Thompson, had actually been arrested a few times back in the day. He'd left Oak Hollow for a while, but recently moved back. He was known for causing trouble, but it seemed like everyone just tolerated it, writing it off as Kyle being Kyle. With Kyle's inconsistent alibi, I convinced the sheriff to get a warrant to search his property. And sure enough, behind the trailer, hidden in the bushes, we found a small backpack. Inside was Lily's phone. It was like a gut punch, a mix of relief and dread. I knew we were close, but this wasn't over. But this, Kyle finally cracked in the interrogation room. He admitted he'd been watching her, following her on her walk home that night. He claimed he just wanted to scare her, that he never intended to hurt anyone. But things escalated when she ran, and he panicked, grabbing her to make her stop screaming. It was a tragic, ugly truth. Lily was found later that night in a shallow ravine. She was bruised and scared but alive. She'd managed to escape Kyle after he'd panicked and left her there. The town was shaken. People were talking about how something like this could have been prevented if they'd acted sooner. But I knew this wasn't just about one man's twisted obsession. It was about the silence that had built up in that place over decades. Oak Hollow had always had secrets, but now, maybe some of them were finally being dragged into the light. And maybe next time, people would speak up before it was too late. Thanks for sticking with me through this story. This case taught me that sometimes it's the things people don't say that reveal the most. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button, subscribe for more, and remember, some secrets aren't worth keeping.